Irby Barton, we're glad to have you with us today to talk about your experiences in life and in the military. This is part of the series of tapes we've been doing over the past couple of years of all of our members that have served in the military over the years. And Irby is one of those that served in Vietnam, and we're going to talk to him a little bit. First, I'd like to ask Irby if he'd give us a rundown of how he got here, where he came from, and what happened in the process of him getting into the military.
Okay, I was born in Toccoa, Georgia in 1943. My dad was unfit for military service, so he was employed at a munitions manufacturing facility up there, Laterno, which was a heavy equipment plant that was converted after the war. He went back to South Georgia where he came from, and so we moved from Cornelia back down to Georgetown, which was his home, and I grew up there. Left there at the age of 18, went to the University of Georgia and started my college education. Money ran out, and when the money ran out, I went to Atlanta and got a job. Got married at 20 years old, and the company I went to work with offered me the opportunity to go to school, so I went to Georgia State and completed an undergraduate degree down there after I came back from Vietnam. But I was in school up until I went over there, got drafted, and left school to do my service, and then came back, completed the undergraduate degree, and then started a master's degree. In my youth, I was joined the Methodist Church at 12 years old. I was the president of the MYF. As I got a little older, I used to do the children's sermons in church, and about once a month and once every 2 months I'd do the regular service in church. So I've been around church all my life and very close to the Lord, I thought, or at least I was trying to be. Went to work with Scripto Incorporated in Atlanta, Georgia, building cigarette lighters and ballpoint pens and pencils and that sort of stuff. And most people that are our age will remember Scripto. But in any event, I left there and went to North Carolina and went to work with Pure Letter Incorporated. And my wife had been working with the Federal Aviation Agency in Atlanta, so we made the move to North Carolina. But before I moved to North Carolina is when I had my stint with the military. So we'll forego the life experiences for the moment and come back to the military and say that when I was in Georgia State, I don't know, I had transferred from Georgia and lost a few credits, had to retake some things, but I was probably in my third year, maybe the end of my third year. And I got a draft notice, and back then draft was still very common. So I decided to accept the draft, go in the military, get the military service out of the way because I was so close to graduating anyway. I figured it was a case of get me now, get me later, because at that time nobody saw an end to the war. So I went into service and went through boot camp at Fort Benning in Columbus. After Fort Benning, they sent me out to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, is where they trained the medical corpsmen, and I was put into the medical corps, and I went through 10 weeks out there. 10 weeks of boot camp, 10 weeks of advanced training in medical school, and from there straight to Vietnam. I got no break to go home anywhere in there. Lied to me all the way. Give me a break behind boot camp, give you a break behind AIT, but it didn't happen. So I went to Vietnam. I was in Vietnam for, I believe, 16 months, Julian. Sometimes I get my numbers mixed up, but I extended for a few months to get out, when I got back stateside, to get out of service, so I wouldn't have any active reserve to do, if you will. While in Vietnam, I was assigned to what's called a MILFAP team. It's a Military Provincial Hospital Advisory Program. And I was assigned to MILFAP Team 19. And we were not primarily intended to be a fighting force. And as I've told a number of people, you know, if you went to Vietnam, you might not be assigned to a fighting unit, but you wound up getting in a fight sometime whether you wanted to or not. In most places, with very few exceptions. Saigon might be the most significant exception. But in any event, we flew into Saigon, and we were in Long Binh Junction, which we were affectionately or disaffectionately called LBJ. President Johnson was the president at the time. And I was there for a couple of weeks, and they sent me up to Pleiku in the Central Highlands in transit to Bamituit, which was my first assigned duty station. And so I was in Pleiku for 2 weeks, and then into Bamituit, and I spent about 7 months, 6 or 7 months in Bamituit, working as a lab technician in the provincial hospital there. Bamituit is the old imperial capital of Vietnam, and a pretty good sized city. I guess maybe it was 125 or 200,000 people, something like that at the time I was there. And a fairly nice city, but when I got there, it had been shot up pretty good. The Tet Offensive in 1968 occurred just a month or two. It was over just a month or two before I got there. And so we walked in right on the heels of things having been very difficult all over Vietnam. I spent my time in Vietnam from the end of the spring of '68 till the summer of '69. And I spent a great deal of time in the surgical suites. We had 4 surgical suites in the civilian hospital in Bamituit. And all I was assigned as a lab technician, I had the reason to put me in the medical corps in the first place is I was in pre-med when I started University of Georgia. I wanted to be a doctor, a medical missionary, really. But so that I wound up in there, and I had this fascination with surgery, and when I had time, they let me get in the surgical suite and operate with some work with, assist some of the doctors, and I really loved that. And we had occasion they had a firefight, major fight in Duklop, which did not make the headlines in the States because we had a very high number of casualties, U.S. casualties there, along with South Korean casualties and South Vietnamese casualties. A very major fight. And we handled in the civilian hospital about 270 plus surgical cases over the course of 3 days. And we adjoined a military hospital right next to us, and they handled substantially more cases there than we did. And of course, when you're handling incoming injured at that kind of rate, you do things sometimes pretty quick and pretty hasty. It's not what you'd like to do, it's what you got to do to keep a guy alive and get to the next one. So some of that was what you might call almost like butcher shop type stuff. It was very quick and dirty to get people aside and handle them. But in any event, got a good taste of surgery and a lot of that type of thing. Dealt with a lot of civilian injuries there. And also control the, they had a large number of prostitutes in town. And they were registered with the U.S. military, and they had to go through a process of being checked for venereal disease on a regular basis. So we handled that VD control program at the civilian hospital. So we dealt with a lot of the local prostitutes, testing them for syphilis and gonorrhea and that type of thing. Well, about 8 months after I got over there, I guess we got a call. Let me tell you this before I do that. My CO didn't like me. First CO liked me well. Second CO, his replacement didn't like. He did to begin with, but I found this kind of interesting, and it was an educational process for me. We had a field major come in one day, and he had, being in the Central Highlands, all of the guys he worked with were Montagnards, very few South Vietnamese. And the South Vietnamese and the Montagnards did not like each other. The Montagnards were indigenous natives to the area, and they were more Polynesian background, Malaysian background than they were Vietnamese or Oriental, kind of a mix. And so he was working with a couple of regiments of mercenaries, paid mercenaries. And these guys had gotten sick. He didn't know what was wrong, but about 70, best I can remember, 60, 70% of his regiment was down sick. So he brought an ambulance load of these guys in there to find out what was wrong with them. Well, this happened in the middle of the day, and in Vietnam, they took a siesta for 2 hours at the middle of every day, from about 11 o'clock to 1 and 2 o'clock. The war stopped, and everybody took a nap, and then they resumed. So, the church staff all went home, and the military, including us, we went, for lunch during that time. And so this major shows up with these Montagnards sick and trying to find a doctor in the compound. Couldn't get the doctor, so I heard he was looking for somebody, so I went back over to the hospital, take a look at these guys, and looked at them and just checked general symptoms, and I thought I immediately recognized malaria. And I had looked at a lot of malaria patients in in cases at that time. And so I prepped some slides to verify it was or was not malaria. And so while I'm waiting on my slides to dry in the lab, which was just inside the front door of the hospital, we're standing out, Major and myself, next to these two ambulances with these Montagnards in them. And the doctor comes up, and the doctor walks over and sticks his nose in the back of one of those ambulances and said, I don't know what it is. It's some kind of virus, but it's not malaria. I don't know what it is. So I said, I'm not going to question the doctor, you know, and I turned around. He's no OB-GYN. I turned around and went in the lab because I knew my slides had been there long enough. So I went in and I threw one of them under the microscope that was malaria, and I threw another one under the microscope that was malaria. All of them had malaria. So I called a doctor in there, and I said, Doc, come in, let me show you this. And he walked in and he looked at it under the microscope. He didn't know what it was. And he asked me, what is it? And I said, it's malaria. Well, that field major heard me say that, and he chewed that doctor up and spit him out. And the doctor held me responsible for that. So from that day forward, he didn't have a lot of use for me. He wanted to find some way to get back at me. Well, long story short, by the time I'd been there about 8 months, they had an attack in Geonea, and the Viet Cong blew up the hospital down there. And the Navy had a medical team in there taking care of Geonea province, which is the smallest province in South Vietnam at the time. And so they pulled their team out, and they requested that MILFAP Team 19 send a detachment into Geonea to provide medical coverage for that province. Well, I got wind of it that the captain was going to send me down there because he wanted to get rid of me. So I beat him to the punch when he walked in the hospital after lunch that day. As he walked by the lab, he said, Barton, my office upstairs. So I followed him right up there, and before he had a chance to say a word, I said, Captain, I understand they need a medic in Geonea. I'd like to volunteer for it. He went ballistic. But that's how I got to Geonea and got away from my CO. In Geonea, I was down there for about another 8 months, and the first day I went down was my first exposure to a combat situation. When we were supposed to leave Bamituit to fly down there, they delayed the flight because there was a firefight underway for control of the airport. And so we waited about an hour or 2 hours, and then they said the firefight had moved far enough away that we could get into the airport. So we left and took off. I can't remember now if we went in on a fixed wing or a helicopter, but in any event, we went down, got off. They picked us up in a Jeep, took us to the little compound we was going to be in, which was about a mile, half mile, something like that. I don't remember, from the airport. And shortly after we got to the compound, we got a radio call for a medic as part of this firefight. And so myself and the doctor went down there. The doctor was from Arkansas. And they had set off a command detonated mine, which was on the end of a wire, like you'd blow up dynamite, you know, like you see in the movies. Well, that's exactly what this was. And they had blown up a Jeep with an American first lieutenant and a Vietnamese major or a lieutenant colonel and 5 or 6 other Vietnamese on a Jeep. Blew the thing right out of the road, and we had to go down there and try to render aid to those guys, but they were beyond help and they all died. But we were taking small arms fire while we were trying to get these guys off the field. But we weren't able to save any of them. Matter of fact, the lieutenant was dead when we got to him, but he didn't know what his heart was still beating. But he was directly above impact, he and the major both, his brains were coming out of his ears and his nose and that kind of thing. But anyway, that kind of set the tone for what was going to be going on in Geonea. We did not get a lot of problems down there. We took a lot of harassment fire, rockets and mortars and that thing occasionally, maybe once, twice, 3 times a week. And every once in a while we'd catch it 2 or 3 nights in a row, but it was pretty much the Viet Cong. If the NVA were coming through the area, they might come in and throw a serious attack at us every once in a while, but for the most part, it was just harassment fire. While I was in Bamituit, I went out on a few patrols with Special Forces. We had a small Special Forces compound attached to the compound I was in. We were in what's called MACV, and I don't even remember what that acronym stands for now, but it was a military command. And we had a lot of different functions centered there and a lot of other functions outlying away from us. And this 5th Special Forces compound had 19 guys in it, and it was attached to the side of our compound. And they had one medic in that compound. And all the rest of these guys, they were all, as you know about 5th Special Forces, pretty independently capable to do many things, but they were not allowed to send a group of guys out without a medic. They needed a medic to be one of the 3, 4, 5 guys that went out on whatever foray they were going on. So if they sent more than one team out at a time and didn't have 2 medics, they would come over and ask if they could get a medic from out of the MACV compound. And there were several of us in the MILFAP team over there. We had 18 and 19 total guys on the team. And if you took the officers out, I guess we had 15, 16 medics there. So they'd get one of the guys off of our team to go with them. So I went out with a couple of those teams a few times. But we never went looking for a fight. And I never recall that we got in one either. We were generally on a mission to do something. The whole function of the MILFAP teams that we were associated with was part of the pacification program. And if you remember Vietnam overall, the focus was on pacification. It was not on aggression. So we were only allowed to return fire when we got fired upon. So if you went out and somebody didn't start a fight with you, you didn't go pick a fight with somebody else. So that's kind of the way that went. But in Gionia, the hospital that I went down to work in down there, they had bombed that thing out pretty bad. And I went in and cleaned up part of it. The structure, central structure of the building was still there in one wing, ward, I guess you would call it. And so I went in and cleaned up one room in there enough that we could use it as a surgical suite. That's actually what it had been to begin with before it got bombed up so bad. But cleaned that up, and we used that. We did some surgery in there. We delivered babies in there. We saw all of our patients in there, and then we put them in the ward if they were going to stay overnight. We handled a lot of civilian trauma in that area with a lot of little boons, little villages. They were called boons around Gionia. Although it was the largest town in the province, it was not very large either, maybe 10 or 15,000 people. And little villages of 300 to 1,500 were very common, just pockmarked all around. And the Viet Cong frequently would go in and they would shoot up one of those villages because they were trying to keep the Montagnards from relaying information to the Americans. Now, the MILFAP teams that I worked with, one of the things that they did, we conducted a lot of med caps, and you've probably heard the term, but that's a military civilian action program. And the MedCap, medical, not a military, medical civilian action program. And the focus of those programs was to go into the local population, civilian population, and provide medical assistance where they didn't have it. And this primarily applied in the Central Highlands because the Montagnards were very much native type individuals. The men wore loincloths, the women wore sarap from the waist down, they were bare chested. They lived in thatched roof buildings, standing on poles, sleeping on the ground with the pigs and the chickens and the dogs right there with them. They cooked under that thatched roof, and about the only thing that did is keep the rain off of them. So they had shamans for medical doctors, if you will, witch doctors, whatever you choose to call them. And we would go into one of those villages to provide medical assistance to these people. And when we did the intelligence program, and there was a subversive or undercover intelligence program that operated in the military called a Phoenix program. And it was very common for one or two of those guys to go along with us when we went on a medcap, so they could try to gather intelligence about the size of a village and who was in charge of it and what the leaning of the village was and that sort of thing. And most of those guys could speak Vietnamese, and they could speak some of the Montagnard dialects. There were 19 different dialects in Montagnard language. But anyway, that was primarily what we did. And it was interesting because I found out over time that as we traveled around, when we got down to Gionia, we had a Jeep that had been abandoned and left by the Navy. And so we kind of took the old Army Jeep that was down there and a couple of other Jeeps and got the motor pool combine the parts and give us a decent vehicle that would run. And the guy took parts from this one and that one and the other one. We wound up with a Jeep in great shape. And then the Navy decided they wanted the Jeep back. And we didn't have any choice. Long story short, we ultimately had to give them the Jeep that we had put together. And they had every part number, serial number, off of every part on their Jeep identified. When we shipped them the bad Jeep, they said, no, this is not our Jeep. So we had to give them. We wound up driving a Cracker Box, an old World War II Cracker Box ambulance with a cross, a red cross on the side of it. And as we would drive that thing from our compound out to whatever boon we were going to on a med camp, it was kind of interesting. A couple of occasions we were driving that thing along and we encountered a firefight. And as we approached that firefight, all of the firing would stop from both sides, from the American side or the South Vietnamese or South Koreans. We had South Koreans fighting over here and Australians as well. And in the Viet Cong, they would just quit shooting at each other, and we'd drive right through the middle of the firefight. When we got on the other side, it would resume. And what that said is we knew, our guys knew who we were, but it also indicated they knew who we were. And the Viet Cong got a lot of medical attention from some of our med caps, just like we did, because you had no way to look at your enemy and know who he was if he wasn't in uniform. The North Vietnamese Army was always in uniform, but the Viet Cong wore the same thing civilians in South Vietnam wore. And you didn't know who you were waiting on, who you were giving medical aid to, the enemy or your friend. For the most part, we thought they were friendlies, but that wasn't always true. So the Viet Cong were not prone to shoot up those ambulances because they knew it was a medical team. They knew what we were going to do. We were going to a village, and probably a lot of their people would get to see the doctor for toothaches or wounds or whatever sickness was going on. So we did a lot of that, and we gained some good information, but that's the way I spent most of my time in Vietnam. Most people that were in Vietnam can't say this, Julian, but I enjoyed part of my time in Vietnam because I dealt with the civilians. I dealt with Montagnards. We had a translator that was a Montagnard lady. She was a trained registered nurse, trained in a hospital in Saigon by the French. She was 32 or 33 years old when I was over there. She called all Americans, I don't care what your age was, grandson. She spoke all 19 dialects of the Montagnard language. She spoke South Vietnamese. She spoke fluent French. She spoke Cambodian. I don't know what this lady's role was in society over there, but I can tell you this. She had a lot of authority. When she said jump, I don't care if it was to the Vietnamese or the Montagnards, the only real question was how high, boss lady. That had a lot of clout. And I was not aware of this when I came back from Vietnam until after I came back. I encountered a book, and in that book, I was reading about a group of KNIGHT, Knights activity in Vietnam, and it was conducted by the Montagnards. And this was under the cover of darkness activities by a group of Montagnards that were trying to take the Central Highlands back and free them from control of South Vietnam. It didn't make any difference to them if you were South Vietnamese or North Vietnamese. They didn't want you in there. They wanted, it was part of the dislike of the Montagnards for the Vietnamese and vice versa. Well, when I came back and I was reading about this, this particular group operated under the cover of darkness. They had a great deal of organization and a great deal of skill, and they had a number of very well-educated, very secretive and effective leadership in that organization. And I always wondered about this little translator. She was part of that structure. You know, I didn't know anything about it when I was there, but she was a delight to talk to, but she was a very well-educated, very smart young woman, and everybody seemed to know who she was. The Montagnards knew who she was. Boy, they didn't give her any flack. Whatever she wanted, she got, just like that. So she was not your average bear, but I enjoyed being with her and spending time. She educated us about a lot of things. We spent a lot of afternoons and mornings with her where we weren't worried about being in a firefight or being in any kind of a dangerous situation. So we had a chance to see part of Vietnam that most soldiers didn't get to see. We got to see a side of it that was really very nice. Most of the guys never had a chance to see that. They didn't have much use for any Vietnamese, alive or dead. You know, it didn't make any difference to them. But I saw a different side of the people. A lot of the Vietnamese were really very, very nice, very cordial, very hospitable. And interestingly enough, you know, in the course of my life, I've worked with and been around a lot of Orientals, Chinese, worked for a Japanese company for 16 years, Koreans, etc. I think the Vietnamese, probably the Vietnamese women were the most beautiful of all of the Oriental women. Facial beauty, they were just really pretty girls, pretty women, and very, very hospitable people. If they were not in a dangerous situation, they were very quick to invite you to come into their home, to share a meal with them, to fellowship with them outside, just have a great time. And the Montagnards were as well, but totally different kind of people. The Montagnards, when we'd go in to do some of these med camps in the villages, if the Montagnards liked you, they would invite you to come and drink wine with them. And if they invited you to drink wine with them, you couldn't refuse to, because if you refused to, you'd never get back in the village. And the intelligence people wouldn't let you do that because they had to get back in those villages. So if we were invited to drink wine with them before we left, then we had to drink wine. And frequently this happened if we flew in on a helicopter, in particular to a boon, to do a med-cap operation to provide some sort of a medical service, and frequently these were inoculations. We might go in and give vaccinations to 1,000 or 1,500 people, or go in and see people for just all kinds of various and sundry things, as well as any that may have been wounded in a firefight somewhere or whatever. We'd be waiting on the helicopter to come back, and the village chief would say, "Let's drink some wine." And they would just go out in the ground somewhere. These guys knew where they had them, but they had jugs sealed with rice and sugar. And the top of the jug was sealed. These were like pottery pots. Some of them were 10 or 15 gallon capacity. Some of them were 50 gallon capacity in terms of water. And they'd seal the tops of these things and they'd ferment. They had them buried in the ground. I don't know how in the world they knew where they were, but they just go dig and they dug up the size container they wanted. They'd take it out, knock the top out of it, knock the clay plug out of the top of it, stuff some banana leaves or some corn shucks or some kind of green in that thing, and then fill it up with water till the surface tension of the water would break right over the top of the container. And then they would ram a hollow reed down through the top of the rice, and if they could get it, they'd get a piece of IV tubing from us and stick on the other end of the reed. And so the reed would pierce the cake of rice that would crust over the top of this thing as it fermented. And so what would happen is you'd pull the water through the rice and up through the straw, you know, and I never understood what the point was about putting the green in it, but it was there. Anyway, you'd start drinking, and they would take a beer can or a Coke can or whatever kind of can, they'd cut the top out of it. And they had a big container of water over here, and they would hand you the straw, and so you would start drinking. You'd drink till they told you to stop. And generally what would happen in one of these deals is you would have 5, 6, 15 guys sitting around this pot and a jug, and they would pass the straw from man to man. And what would happen is the guy that's down there with the jug of water in the can, as you drink, he's filling it back up. Well, he would always take one full can and he would pour out of that can until he poured the whole can in. And when the whole can was in there, you stop, pass it to the next guy around. Or he may tell you drink 3 cups. So you drink 3 cans. Well, you could get pretty well snockered and drinking wine with them. And if you got sick, you just get up and walk outside and heave and come back in and sit down and keep drinking. But you didn't quit drinking until they told you to quit. Well, they'd give you brass bracelets if you sat down and drank with them. It was to recognize you as a friend. So the next time you came back, they didn't have to know if they knew you or whatever. They could look on your arm, and if you had a brass bracelet on your arm, they knew that. So a lot of guys walked around there and they had 6, 8, 10 of these brass bracelets on their arm, and some of them had them on both sides. Because we went into so many of these villages, it kind of identified you real quick. And so that helped ease a lot of things as we went in. If you went into a village, you'd been there before, the people saw you, they knew you as a friend because of those bracelets they gave you. So it became a little bit of a symbol, a status symbol with some of the guys to collect these bracelets. But
Was this a rice wine?
it was a rice wine, and I was trying to remember. My memory's gone now. I can't remember what they used to call it. But there was a name for it. But I'll tell you, it was, some of it varied in taste. Some of it was sweet. Some of it was a little bit sour. But it didn't taste all that strong. But I'll tell you what, it would put you on your knees in pretty short order. But we did a lot of movement over there. I flew back and forth from Bamituit to Gianilla by fixed wing because you couldn't drive that far. The roads were not that good, and you could get into some situations where you might drive over a landmine, or you might drive over a command detonated mine. Of course, we weren't. If I was driving an ambulance, I wouldn't be worried too much about a command detonated mine. But they also had other just simple landmines in the roads, and you didn't want to travel too far outside of your area where, otherwise you could get into some really serious problems. So a lot of the travel was done by helicopter. But I was free. I had a great deal of latitude in Gianilla to go. I didn't even have to talk to the doctor about where I was going. I just tell him I'm going to Bamituit, I'm going to Saigon, whatever. He let me do whatever I wanted to do. I went down to Saigon one time to get medical supplies. We needed medical supplies real bad, and I just got on a USAID. MILFAP was tied to the USAID program, which was the major pacification effort for all of Vietnam, and they had a fleet of their own aircraft over there. And I could get on if they had space on a flight, I could get on a flight and fly anywhere in Saigon and anywhere in Vietnam I wanted to go. And I frequently did. I'd fly over to Nha Trang or down I didn't go to Saigon but the one time, but flew over to Nha Trang several times, Dalat, just different places. But could jump a rotary wing to Bamituit, and that's where most of those, I never got on one going anywhere else because they had 2 or 3 helicopter assault squadrons in Bamituit on the opposite side of town from where the McVie compound was. And they took some heavy-duty rocket attacks on a pretty regular basis over there, but they flew rotary wings to provide service to a lot of other functions like ourselves, to get us to and from various moons. And so I don't know how many hours I spent on a helicopter, but I probably had enough hours to get a medal, but I wasn't one of those kind of guys that, they tracked my hours for flight time because I wasn't paid to be on a helicopter.
I've often wondered, was all of Vietnam involved in the war?
Yes, it ranged from one end to the other. The Mekong Delta down in I Corps, the South Vietnam by the U.S. military was divided into 4 sections, if I recall right, 4 or 5, I believe it was 4. And they called it I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, and 4 Corps. And it started in the South, and the Mekong Delta was in I Corps, and then it progressed north. And my brother, who was in the Marine Corps, he was in his second tour over there while I was wrapping mine up. He came back in country, and I actually flew up to Da Nang and spent a week up there with him. But the Marines were primarily up in the northern section in the 4 Corps, and they had the most interface with the NVA, which is why most of what you'll read about the really severe engagements and firefights in Vietnam involved the Marines. It's because the bulk of the 4 Corps was manned by the Marines, and we had Army up there as well. But the Marines early on in the war took some heavy casualties and had some major battles in 4 Corps. We had some as well in other areas, but you don't hear as much about those as you do some of the others. But as far as I know, the whole country was involved, different areas to more or less degree. We, as an example, Bamituit is not that far from the border with Cambodia, and one time one of the helicopter flights I was on inadvertently sat us down in Cambodia. We almost got in a situation we couldn't get out of. But we were that close to the border. We were about 19 kilometers, which is a little less than 10 miles from the Cambodian border at a couple of locations that we served. And it was easy to make a little mistake there if you weren't careful. But Duke Lop was, that I mentioned earlier, where they had such a firefight that didn't get reported over here. was almost sitting on the Cambodian border. And right down through that part of Cambodia coming into Vietnam was what was referred to as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a pass through those mountains in that area, and it was much easier to travel through there than it was some other areas. So we tended to have a lot of firefights in that area around Duklop, because that kind of controlled that border crossing, that easy area to come through there. And that's why they had such a vicious fight down there. And it was kind of interesting. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but that firefight started because of an elephant. They had the NVA was camped down there, and the Americans were camped down there, and the South Koreans were camped down there, and a small contingent of Australians were camped down there, and some South Vietnamese as well. And they had the one force over here and the other force over here. Neither one knew the other one was there. And so they both had sentries out, and an elephant comes walking through the jungle, and somebody's tried to tell that elephant to halt or I'll shoot. And the elephant didn't halt. So they started shooting. When one side started shooting, the other side started shooting. And 3 days later, there were about 4,000 dead people down there from that. But it was unreal, but it was crazy. I don't know about other areas. I know in the river areas of the Mekong Delta, I did not spend any time in I Corps. Really didn't spend any time in 2 Corps, or I'm sorry, in 3 Corps or 4 Corps. If I recall right, Pleiku was in 3 Corps. It was north of Bami Tuet. But I was only there the 2 weeks that I was waiting to get into Bami Tuet. And then my brother was up in 4 Corps with the Marines. He was stationed at Red Beach the second time he was up there, and I went up. Got out on a powder burn with those guys. They had some obsolete artillery powder, and periodically they'd have to take this stuff and dispose of it. Now, he was assigned at Red Beach. They had a large ammunition storage site up there, and it burned, and it got a lot of coverage stateside. It burned for 3 or 4 days, and when it burned, there was a smaller ammo dump across the road from the one that the Vietnamese, the NVA or Viet Cong, I'm not sure who, but they managed to set the thing on fire, and once you started explosions, it started burning, and it burned for days. But they moved across the road and built up the smaller one, and that's where my brother was when I went up to see him. And they had, if this artillery powder got too old, and they had a lot of it, a lot of other munitions, but they'd take this powder out and burn it. Because if you didn't, if it was out of date, or if it was too old, there was a high probability that you would try to fire a mortar or a howitzer round or whatever it was propelling, and it would fall short of its target because the strength of the powder was gone. So they'd take this stuff out and burn it. It still had a lot of kick to it. And when I say take it out and burn it, I'm talking about a convoy of maybe 20 or 30 deuce and a halves carrying a couple thousand pounds of artillery powder each. And so you go out and you burn 60,000 pounds of artillery powder, and you wind up with a pile of artillery powder 5, 6 foot high, 8 foot high, and it might be 30 or 40 feet or yards long, half a football field or more. And when you stick a match to this stuff, you better be a long way away. And my brother was in EOD the second. He was in the radio corps the first time, but he was in the EOD the second time. So his job was to light this stuff off and burn it. And he and the group that he worked with. So I went out with them, and they did this powder burn one day. I was up there with him, and they rolled off, I guess the same type of fuse like you would use with dynamite from this stuff, and they rolled it off. I couldn't believe this, but they rolled it off about a quarter of a mile, and then they set that fuse on fire, and there wasn't but one guy that set it on fire in a Jeep, and then he'd jump in that Jeep and he would haul buggy. And we were, when they set that stuff on fire today, I was down there with them. I had a video camera I took to Vietnam with me at the time, and I was going to film this. Now, they said, keep in mind, it's 105, 110 degrees in the summer, so it was already hot. And they said the temperature is going to go up 5 or 10 degrees. And we were a mile away from where this powder was going to burn. I couldn't believe this. I said, no, I got to see this. So we laid down in the back of a deuce and a half with the tailgate up, and I had my little camera sitting on my shoulder up over the top edge of the back tailgate on that thing. And sure enough, when they lit that powder and that stuff went off, it had a monster flame. I don't know how high the flame went up in there. It must have been 100 feet at least, if not substantially more than that. And it ran from one end of that powder pile to the other all the way across that thing, and the heat was intense as far away as we were. You could feel the heat rise. And I filmed that, and it was so bright. When you looked at the film of that, the picture just disappears. It just turns black. It just blacked the film right out until it started to subside, and you could see the image come back in. Never saw anything like it in my life. Well, coincidentally, there was a boy there from Eufaula, Alabama. And Georgetown, Georgia, where I grew up, is across the river from Eufaula. And he also was in the EOD, and he and my brother were at Red Beach at the same time. And a couple weeks after I was up there, he was out, and he was the trigger man for another powder burn out there, and he was too close, and they had faulty fusing or whatever, I don't know, but he didn't get far enough away from that powder before it went up, and he got third-degree burns all over the backside of his body. It almost killed him, but just astonishing. But we burned a lot of that. In Gianea, a little compound I was in, we had on more than one occasion, only once while I was there, but on more than one occasion, we had an ARVN South Vietnamese camp just above our camp on the side of, I won't call it a mountain, a hill, but they were probably 50 or 100 yards higher elevation than we were. And they fired some artillery rounds out of their camp, tried to fire some, and they were using bad powder. It was out of date, and the round wound up coming into our compound, and they injured a couple guys in our compound, not when I was there, but on a previous occasion before I got over here, where they shot duds into our compound. So that's why they burned that powder. But it was still dangerous stuff.
It was all very interesting.
It is. I wouldn't take anything for it, but you couldn't give me enough money to do it again.
It's great to be part of your history in the background from before, not now. Well, what happened when you got out of the service?
Well, after I came back from Vietnam, I resumed my education at Georgia State in Atlanta and finished up my undergraduate degree, and then I started a master's degree up there. I had one little event that I'll tell you about. When I came back, the first quarter I was back in at the time, Georgia State was on the quarter system. I wound up in I don't remember if it was an economics course or insurance course or whatever, but anyway, Georgia State followed a Harvard concept of teaching. They put people together on project teams to learn about business. They would assign you a project, and you'd go into several businesses and study that particular business and try to find a way to improve something about it. A quick instance of that, we went into a dairy, one of the teams I was on one time in one of the programs, and we studied the dairy, and the study was, would it be less expensive to use paper cartons, glass jugs, or plastic containers to put milk in? That was the project that we did. And one of the guys that was on the project team worked in this particular business. That's how we got in there. So anyway, I met this guy the first of the quarter. We were on the same team, and so we went out for a beer to kind of get to know each other and that sort of thing after school one night. And so we walked into this bar in a hotel and ordered a beer and sat down at the table. There's a guy sitting up at the bar talking to the bartender. And I hadn't been back from Vietnam maybe 4 weeks. And this guy fired a pistol in there, a Stardust pistol with blanks in it. And just natural reaction, I dove under a table, and what in the world? And I got up, and this guy's a veteran from World War II, and I went over and I said, what in the world are you doing, man? He said, no, this is just a Stardust pistol, I ain't gonna hurt anything. I said, do me a favor, will you? I said, I just came back from Vietnam, and I'm a little bit jumpy. I said, don't shoot that pistol in here again. And so he was nice enough. He got up and left, which made me happy, but it just showed you I was a little bit jumpy when you hear unexpected noises. But after I got back in, finished that up. I made the decision to move to North Carolina, as I said at the outset of this interview. And so we moved up there. At that time, I had a son, a 2-year-old son, and he was not 2, I'm sorry. He was maybe 2 months. He'd just been born. He wasn't much more than a newborn. But we moved up there, went to work with Pure Letter, and did very well with those folks. I stayed up there for 10 years. The last year I was up there, my wife died of breast cancer. And shortly thereafter, I had a company here in LaGrange pursuing me to come down here and go to work with them. And the way they got my name is they had a boy that had been an engineer down here, had gone to work with my company. And he knew that they were looking for somebody to run their manufacturing operation down here. And so he called them and gave them my name. So it was kind of a swap. He went up there and they wound up getting me down here. But I had been to LaGrange one time before I moved here, and it was not a good experience. I was hitchhiking from University of Georgia home, and I got here one night and I couldn't get a ride out. And so I said, I won't ever go back to LaGrange again. And when these guys called me about coming down here to interview for a job running their manufacturing operation, I had no desire to come to LaGrange. So it took them about 3 months to talk me into coming down here just to do an interview. And I finally decided, if for no other reason, just to get this guy off of my back, I'd come down here and see what he was talking about. And LaGrange was quite different than the first time I came through here at the age of 18. It had changed dramatically. It had a very nice developing industrial park. The city fathers had changed. The mindset about what the city needed to do was quite different. I found it to be a pretty little town. Long story short, took the job. Moved to LaGrange, and I've been here for about 32 years now. And been a member of this church for the last 31 years of that time. And have just absolutely loved LaGrange. Had the opportunity to leave it several times. Took a couple jobs out of town, but I never left LaGrange. I kept a job that was close enough to LaGrange that I could commute, one in Newnan and one in Peachtree City. I worked with Kadon Corporation here in LaGrange for 3 years when I first moved here, and then moved up to Newnan and worked with Wheelabrator Corporation. Moved them down from Mishawaka, Indiana. Expanded the building they bought in Newnan and installed all of their office systems up there. I was their facilities manager and helped with the plant here in LaGrange. I bought the office systems and telephone security systems for them as well as for the facility in Newnan. And then I left those guys after 3 years and went to work. I think I misspoke. I was with Kadon 5 years. I was with Wheelabrator 3 years. And then I went to work with Hoshizaki America in Peachtree City. And I was with those guys 16 years before I retired, and served as vice president over there for the better part of that time, about 13 years, I think. Retired as a senior advisor to the upper management team, manufacturing, senior manufacturing VP, and the general manager and executive vice president. But I retired a couple of years early. I've been at it 45 years. Manufacturing's hard on you, just like war. And wouldn't take anything for either one of them, but kind of glad to get out of the manufacturing world and get into doing some other things.
Well, I'll have to admit, this is the most in-depth discussion I've ever had, or report or description I've ever had about what happened in Vietnam. And you've enlightened me a great deal. I'm sure whoever's watching this video is greatly enlightened too.
Well, I hope so. Like I say, there are good things I like to remember about Vietnam, and there are bad things. Over the years, what I've tried to do is put the bad stuff out of my mind and remember the good things, because it's just easier to recall the good things than it is the bad things. But every once in a while, some of the dark and dirty comes to mind. I will share this with you as a part of this interview as well. While I said early on that I grew up in a Methodist church and was very close to the Lord. When I was at the University of Georgia, I studied, was a co-starter of a Bible study in the dormitory room. And every Thursday night we'd meet and we'd start a discussion, just randomly open the Bible, pick some scripture, read a few verses, and then we'd talk about what that meant. And whoever wanted to come in could come in. Well, we had one boy in the group that contended he was an atheist, and he was always down there to challenge anything we said about the scripture. But I was proud to say that when we finished up that first year, at the end of the third quarter, he was going over to the Baptist Student Union, and I think we were getting the upper hand. But anyway, when I went to Vietnam, I went over there with, I thought, a good solid faith. And then during the course of some of the things that happened in Neil, you see a lot of people, and I don't want to get into too much of this, but I saw quite a number of people die. Quite a number of people severely wounded and blown up and torn apart and what have you. And, you get case hardened to that over a period of time in order to deal with it. If you don't, you just mentally turn to mush. Well, I was over at the compound at the hospital there one day, and they brought a 5-year-old girl in there, and this happened again at noon, and the doctor was not there. He was over at the compound, had lunch. I had come back over to do some work, cleaning up and rebuilding part of the clinic area that we were using. They brought this child in. It's a beautiful little girl, nothing wrong with her. She wasn't involved in a war or anything else, and here she was. It was obvious to me in fairly short order the girl was dying, but I couldn't tell why. I didn't know what was wrong with her. And I couldn't reach the doctor, and it wouldn't have made any difference if I did. It turns out after the fact that I found out she had a brain aneurysm, and it killed her in pretty short order. But she died in my arms, and it upset me because she was this innocent little child, wasn't involved with the war. She didn't know or understand anything about that. I just asked God to spare that child because I didn't know how to do anything to help her. And he didn't do it, and I got so upset with God, I just walked out on the back veranda behind that ward, and I just shook my fist at heavens and cursed his name and told him, you know, I'll never have anything else to do with you. You won't save this child. It was just so unfair. Anyway, I turned my back on him for 10 years, and when I wound up in North Carolina with my wife, and she developed cancer. Well, my life had been going along, Julian, pretty well at that point. I thought I had the reins pretty much under control. Things were going my way the way I wanted them to, when I wanted them to, and I had it all going. But that cancer hit my wife at 32. We thought we had that whipped, and then 3 years later it came back, and we found out we didn't have it whipped. And as I started to drive her back and forth to Duke University Hospital every day, and that was a 180-mile round trip, and she spent 13 weeks in the hospital up there with 5 different surgeries. During some of those surgeries, when I'm driving back and forth by myself, as I leave her up there, I didn't drive back and forth every night, but often did when she was in the hospital some of those nights. I just promised the Lord that if he would do something to save my wife, I'd do anything he wanted. Well, he didn't do anything to save my wife because I think he was using my wife's death to save me. And in any event, I lost my wife, but I felt like, you know, I had paid the penalty in that perhaps was fair for some of the things I'd done. I was lucky the Lord didn't strike me with lightning for some of the things I said and did when I was in Vietnam, alluding to what I talked about earlier. But anyway, out of the course of all of this that had occurred, I had a young girl that worked for me at Purelator that was when I was managing the quality control department. And I'm not managing the quality control department. When my wife died, I was managing the manufacturing engineering department. But she was still working there in the quality department. My wife got sick, and she instigated a lot of the people in the quality department preparing food, sending cards and that sort of thing to my wife to let her know that they were thinking about her, etc. And while my wife was in the hospital during one of the stints where she was having surgery, we were talking after she was recovering, and she knew she was dying, and I did too at this point. It's late in the game. And she asked me if I was going to remarry. Well, I said, you know, I don't have any idea. I hadn't thought about remarrying, you know, thinking about trying to keep you alive. And she brings this young woman's name up. You ought to marry this young woman. And I said, I don't know. I had taken her out with my brother on a double date one time. My brother was single. He and his wife had gotten divorced, and I'd got her to go out on a date with him. And my wife knew, I thought, a good deal of this lady, and she said, you ought to take her out. Well, dismissed it, didn't think anything about it. Well, later after she died, a month or so after she died, I was cleaning house one Sunday afternoon, and I was beginning to feel the pangs of loneliness and the grieving process. You know, I had been grieving for the better part of the year that I knew I was going to lose my wife, but that didn't change anything. And just so lonely that Sunday afternoon. I was vacuuming my living room. I just stopped the vacuum and got down on my knees. And I just prayed to God to just send me somebody that would be a companion, keep me from being so lonely, to help me get over what I was doing. I finished my prayer and I got up off of my knees, and less than 10 seconds later, I didn't even walk out of the living room. Less than 10 seconds later, the front doorbell rang. And I was standing 5 feet from my door. So I just reached over and opened my door, and here stands this young woman with a young guy that worked for me. And when I was running the quality department, and they came in and visited, and I just, seeing this girl just struck me like a ton of bricks. All of the things that didn't happen, I didn't think that was all coincidence. So long story short, the next week I invited her to go out for dinner or whatever, and we started a relationship and what have you. Long story short, a few months, we got married, and she's currently my wife, and we've been married for 34 years. And so I felt like the Lord answered that prayer, and he used her to keep me in the church and very close to him, and I'm thankful for that. So I've had some ups and downs, and the war was part of the downs, but it was part of my maturing process, and I'm very thankful that he chose to call me back instead of strike me with a bolt of lightning. And so I'm in this church today, and I'm thankful for this church. It's been an integral part of my life. I joined it, like I say, 31 years ago. Right before Dr. Baxter got here, I became a member of this church. So that's pretty much my story.
Well, it's a very interesting story, and certainly a great testimonial here at the end.
Thank you.
And we thank you for being with us, and I want to thank Paul Barnes for doing this, and also to let you know we're making 4 copies, as you probably already know. One will be in our archives storage area, one will be in the church library, one downtown in the historical committee, I think it's called, down in the old CNS Bank building, and one copy for you if we don't lose it. That's an inside story.
Right. I understand.
But thank you so much, Irby.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My privilege.
Great report and interview.
Thanks, sir.